Okay, right, so let's be honest here. The price for a decent bike these days can be pretty astronomical.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
So for the last 5 years or so, I've built all of my bikes using cheaper Chinese parts, mainly from places like AliExpress. And I don't just mean the frame and a set of wheels, I mean everything. Group set, handlebars, cassette, chain, crankset, even small things like disc rotors and bar tape, all much cheaper alternatives to what I think most people are gonna be familiar with. But I've come to realize over the last few years of struggle, honestly, there's one particular part of the bike where in most cases, buying the cheaper alternative, it's not the move, and it's the bottom bracket. Now, there are cases where it does make sense, but yeah, let's talk about it. My name, as always, is Luke, and welcome back to this little corner of my kitchen. I'm looking directly at my air fryer right now. I'm taking risks, ladies and gentlemen. Openly discussing bottom brackets on the internet is basically an extreme sport at this point. Very high stakes, very strong opinions. I can see my neighbor's cat on the roof. What are you doing up there? In fact, if you say bottom bracket 3 times in a row, a mechanical engineer will appear behind you with a bore gauge and a set of Mitutoyo calipers. But look, all jokes aside, it is actually a really interesting topic, a massive rabbit hole if you want to delve into it. But today I'm going to discuss the shortcomings I faced with the cheaper AliExpress bottom brackets and also compare it to some name brand stuff from SRAM and Shimano, which ultimately come out very favorably. I mean, it is tempting, right? Places like AliExpress have thousands of these things. They look really nice and they are so cheap. I mean, this one looks great, comes in some funky colors, and it's like a $5. You can find every conceivable standard and stuff you'd normally pay, you know, a bit of a premium for, like ceramic bearings in there. They're usually just a few extra quid. Like this one, nice looking gold bottom bracket. It's got aluminium cups, $5. The upgraded ceramic version is just under 15 quid, and it's got an aluminium sheath in the middle as well. But, and I'm sure there are some exceptions, most of these cheap bottom brackets have one pretty major drawback, which in my experience kills them way faster than anything else. No expense spared for this part of the episode. I dropped 6 quid on one of those cheap bottom brackets. Crazy. That's nearly 2 meal deals from Tesco. But anyway, I'll compare it to an official Shimano one so you can really see the difference.
The materials are roughly the same. Machined aluminium cups, sleeve between the two, plastic dust caps, and beneath that, cartridge bearings. In fact, they even weigh pretty much the same, but this Shimano one will easily outlast the cheaper version. So let's pull off the dust caps, and interestingly, this cheap one has grease here from the factory, which you don't always see, but sat behind it is a cheap, no-name bearing with pretty light seals. Looking at the dust cap, it's also nothing special, and the tolerances are pretty loose. I can get a fingernail behind this, so yeah, it's easy for water and grime to get in there and sit right next to the bearing. By comparison, on the Shimano one, the dust cap is pretty recessed actually. The tolerances are already much better there, and if I get the dust cap off, which takes a second actually because the fitment is much better, the two bearings do not look the same. This is a very cheap off-the-shelf bearing, whereas the Shimano one has a custom lip seal specific to this design, which interfaces with a stepped ring on the back of the dust cap. This acts like an additional labyrinth seal, keeping water and grime out. It's a custom bearing and a really effective design. And it's a similar story if we look at SRAM. So I've run a few cheap BSA dub bottom brackets in my time. Pretty much without fail, the bearings have seized on me. This is a perfect example. I picked up this BSA dub bottom bracket for about 10 quid on AliExpress last year, and this is the state of it after just 600 miles of British weather.
Yeah, really. Not smooth at all. So I've pulled off the non-drive side crank arm. This bearing's fine, but this one here, it's nearly completely seized. I mean, that's bonkers. Doesn't spin at all. Okay, I've just pulled this cap off of the bearing, and you can see I've put some grease behind there to try and keep water out. But yeah, that's completely seized. So the only reason it was turning at all was because the actual, this sheath itself was spinning inside the inner race. Yeah, crazy. That bearing is yeah, completely seized. I might try and pull it out and see if I can, refresh it, but that is nuts. Completely stuck.
I actually tried to revive the bearing. I boiled it, dropped it in acetone, and managed to get it freed up. So re-greased it and stuck it back in, but it was completely cooked. Around 50 miles later, this is what it sounded like. Now, I've actually had this exact thing happen to another cheap BSA dub bottom bracket that I used on my gravel bike. Again, the bearing just seized solid after about 500 miles. So this time, I pulled it out and replaced it with an official SRAM one. On the cheap ones, again, dust caps are quite basic with a pretty loose fit. On the SRAM one, there's an additional blue rubber seal around the axle, and the fitment on the cap in general is just much better. With them off, as you saw, basic, very cheap cartridge bearings on the AliExpress bottom bracket, whereas the SRAM one has an additional lip seal running around the dust cap. So again, a completely non-standard bearing designed precisely for better weather sealing. Basically, it's much easier for water to get trapped and sit right next to the bearings on these cheaper BBs. Combine that with the fact that the bearings use pretty rubbish contact seals anyway, so water easily creeps in as they rotate. Come back home after a ride in the rain, leave your bike sat a day or two, and boom, the bottom bracket is rusted solid.
Now, there will be a comment under this video to the effect of, I live directly in a swamp, it's Yoda's old gaff, I bought it shortly after he vaporized in episode 6. My cheap bottom bracket lasted 89 trillion miles doing laps of Dagobah. Liar! But here in the real world, yeah, my experience has taught me if you ride in varied conditions, these cheap bottom brackets generally won't last. Right, ultra quick sponsor for you. If you like cycling, you might want some clothes to kind of go with it. I've used Sirocco stuff on, no joke, every ride for over 5 years at this point. It's great value and legitimately well-made stuff. Everything from socks to jerseys, bib shorts, jackets, glasses. If you use my link in the description or scan this QR code, it'll get you 10% off everything they've got, and it helps me out a little bit as well, which is cool. So yeah, check them out if you fancy it. And thanks for listening. We're done. Here's the kicker, right? A decent Shimano or SRAM bottom bracket, they're not that expensive. In fact, the Shimano BSA one, it's often cheaper than a lot of the AliExpress versions. If you shop around, you can get it for about 12 quid. The SRAM ones are a little bit more, maybe 20 to 30 quid, but they're so much less faff, they'll easily last 3 or 4 times longer. And as much as it pains me to say, because I am a massive cheapskate, it is a bit of a no-brainer. Over the years, I have really tried to make these cheaper BBs work. You can extend their lifespan by putting some grease behind the dust caps and trying to dry them out after a wet ride, but for the most part, the bearings are just built to a much lower standard. The contact seals are really crummy, water eventually gets in, and after that, they deteriorate very quickly. Plus, the steel races and ball bearings inside typically have a worse heat treatment, and the grease used as well is lower quality too. They'll feel smooth out of the box, but that doesn't last. However, there is one scenario where I found cheaper BBs can actually make sense. Internal T47 bottom brackets, ones like this one where the whole unit is inside the frame. In my experience, cheaper BBs do last a decent amount of time. In fact, this bike here I built a couple of years ago, it's got a ZTTO T47 bottom bracket in there, about 5,000–6,000 miles on it, so nothing crazy, but minimal maintenance, ridden in all weathers. Yeah, still nice and smooth. Now, T47 doesn't magically make cheaper bearings better. The ones in there are still completely unbranded, no-name bearings, right? But it does give them a much easier life.
The bottom bracket shell itself is chunkier and it sits inside the frame, so it's just a much stiffer design. Less flex, less chance of axial load, and the bearings are less exposed. They're better shielded from spray and grime as you're riding and last a lot longer as a result. There are obviously a number of other factors at play, but as a general rule, I'd say if your bottom bracket uses external cups, stick with OEM or good quality units. Internal designs, especially threaded ones, tend to be far more forgiving, so cheaper versions are much more viable in my experience, and I've linked a few of my favorites in the description.
Okay, right, so this is a little bit of a tricky one, right? Because if you've watched any bike servicing videos online, you've probably seen people face the kind of face of the BB shell and also chase any threads in there as well. But it almost feels a bit like this.
Sorry, are you saying you just installed the bottom bracket straight into the frame? You didn't chase the threads or face it or anything, no? Can you Could you get out of my house? I think I'm gonna be sick.
Now the theory is sound, right? Because the bearings need to sit perfectly square and aligned, because if they're not, when you install the crank, it effectively forces them into alignment, which could sideload those bearings, increasing the wear, shortening their life, and stuff won't spin as freely. Plus, there's a less than zero chance that a bike mechanic will just grab your head and hold it underwater until you stop breathing. But it feels like it's presented almost as a prerequisite at this point. I think most frames, even the cheaper ones, are machined pretty well. You might need to clean a bit of paint overspray out of the threads, but I think wildly crooked BB shells are far less common than the internet would lead you to believe.
Are you sure about that?
I found weatherproofing and keeping water out of the bearings to be a much bigger factor day to day. But that being said, if you are getting through bottom brackets quickly, especially decent quality ones, then yeah, facing the shell and chasing the threads, definitely worth considering. Anyway, I hope that helps a couple of you out. Let's be honest, if we'd have stuck with square taper bottom brackets, none of these problems would have been problems in the first place. See you next time.